Sisters and brothers, welcome. I trust that you slept well and have breakfasted well. It's my pleasure to chair, not to introduce, because you know him, our brother Roger Straughan. Roger has had a distinguished academic...
Checkered, I think.
Has a an incident-filled, thrilling academic career. Sometimes, as someone who's done a little bit of academic work, I always get slightly cross when people suggest that academics are people without imagination. In fact, of course, any academic with any degree of success or professionalism has to constantly use what we believe the divine gift of imagination. Roger combines both the value of academic rigour, of getting the facts straight, properly ordered, and the correct balance of text and footnotes that are required, with his own insights into a range of issues. And some of you will have read his fascinating book relating to the access we have to the imaginary faculty of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, which is an interest that we both share, as it were, independently. Roger's been doing some work on something which was I had heard reference to, but certainly obscure to me. And so, Roger, we look forward to hearing your talk, All in the Imagination, Some Clues from Imaginism.
Well, thank you, Kevin, very much for that introduction. As you all know, the theme of this conference is images and imagination. And that's a theme that gives us a lot of scope. I imagine that's why it was chosen, because it can be interpreted in so many different ways. And I'm going to try to tackle a particular perspective on imagination, rather unusual perspective, and I think it raises some fundamental and, to me at least, fascinating questions. And I'd better warn you in advance that this may take us into some fairly deep waters, take me into deep waters, I can tell you. And so I'm going to try and make sure we don't go too far out of our depth and sink without trace. Now, it's always a good idea, I think, to start with that very simple sounding question that Socrates was so keen on asking over 2,000 years ago. What do we mean? What are we talking about? What do we mean by the words that we're using? And that's particularly important in this case, I think, because that word imagination can have various meanings and it carries with it various associations. And not all those associations are complementary or positive. For example, we can dismiss what someone is saying by retorting, "Oh, that's just your imagination." Or we can cast aspersions on someone's reliability, their truthfulness, by saying, "Oh, they've got a vivid imagination, haven't they?" Or we can call something just imaginary, a sort of throwaway sense, suggesting that it's unreal, it's untrue, it's not really worth paying attention to, it's just imaginary. So the contrast in all those cases is between imagination, sorry, here goes my croaky throat as usual. The contrast is between imagination and what's thought to be real or true. We often come across this disparaging sense of imagination in one of our own areas of interest, that is the reporting of psychical experiences. Because the stock response of the skeptic, the hardline skeptic, to any reports of anything psychic is something like, "Oh, they must have imagined it." The implication is that these things don't happen in the real world. Well, we certainly do use the words imagine and imagination like that sometimes. But the ideas I want to look at today present imagination in a completely different light. Far from using the word to refer to what's unreal or untrue, they claim that imagining and imagination are really at the basis of everything. They're supremely important. In other words, it really is all in the imagination, literally. And what's more, it's claimed that this view of imagination gives us a few clues to those so-called big questions. Questions like, how did we get here? Where are we going? How does creation work? Why is there pain and evil in the world? Well, if imagination really can cast a bit of light on some of those questions, it's worth having a look at, I think. Now, the ideas I'm going to refer to are usually referred to as Imaginism. Imaginism. And I'm going to use that label for convenience, although actually I'm not very keen on isms of any kind. I try to avoid them where possible. But again, for convenience, I'm going to call Imaginism a theory, although it's certainly not a scientific theory as such. It can't be tested by setting up experiments, for example. But it is a theory in the sense of being a set of ideas that hang together, a set of speculations that may throw possible light on further, deeper questions, some of those big questions I just mentioned. Now, I won't be a bit surprised if none of you ever heard of Imaginism, or of the man who did most to develop the theory. I certainly hadn't heard of them, or of him, until I read a certain book which I'm going to mention in a minute. Imaginism arose from the work of a man named Douglas Fawcett. Douglas Fawcett. Just out of interest, who here has heard of Douglas Fawcett? Put your hand up. Come on, be a bit more bold than that. Look, that's better. Right? You don't count. 1, 2, 3. That's about what I would have expected, actually. And I'll say I don't blame the rest of you in the slightest. Well, Fawcett was I hadn't heard of him until I got involved in this, and I should have done. Anyway, Douglas Fawcett was a very interesting, fascinating character in his own right, apart from devising this theory. He was a man of many parts, many skills, many achievements. Something he shared with a number of people of his period, because he was born in the 1860s and died in the 1960s, very long life. He was a prolific author. He wrote novels, mainly science fiction. He wrote a lot about religion and philosophy. He was a poet. He was a theosophist. He was a championship chess player, playing in all the tournaments up to his mid-90s. He was still taking part in chess tournaments in Hastings, I think it was, in the mid-90s. He was a mountaineer. He regularly, every year, in fact, during his active life, he climbed the Matterhorn as a matter of course. You know, we go on holiday to Blackpool. He climbed the Matterhorn. He carried on doing that till he was about 66, I think. When he was 66, he was halfway up the Matterhorn and he had a heart attack. But he had a good night's sleep and decided to carry on the next day, got to the top, and still did the Matterhorn that year, despite his heart attack. He was also a pioneer motorist, early 20th century, a pioneer motorcyclist, and a pioneer aviator. In fact, when he gave up climbing the Matterhorn, he decided he wanted something else to do, so he took up flying in his late 60s. And one of his favourite hobbies then was flying over the Alps and taking photographs from his aeroplane. And he carried on that into his 80s when the authorities decided that they couldn't really renew his pilot's licence much longer. And he managed to combine these very wide-ranging interests in a number of unusual ways. For example, he was the first person, and I would guess probably the only person, ever to drive a motor car up a glacier on Mont Blanc. And the vehicle he used to do it was a 1903 model, which makes Genevieve look like something quite modern, actually. I've seen a picture of it. So he drove up the glacier on the Matterhorn in this car. More seriously, two of his most important books about Imaginism, they were entitled the Zermatt Dialogues and the Oberland Dialogues. And they are called that because they take the form of lengthy philosophical debates and discussions, imaginary I imagine, between five mountaineers high up in the Alps. So the books form this dialogue between these men up in the mountains. Very unusual way of presenting philosophical ideas. But, extraordinary man though he was, I doubt whether I would have heard of him or his ideas if I hadn't come across him in a book by another author who I guess will be much more familiar to some of you at least, Rainer Johnson, the author Rainer Johnson. Now, Rainer Johnson's books on psychical research, mysticism, religion still turn up regularly on the second-hand table. There's one there I noticed today, so if you want to get there quickly, you might get that one. That's The Imprisoned Splendour. Wonderful titles he always had. And in fact, he was one of the most popular authors with the early members of the fellowship, according to a survey that was done in those early years. Again, out of interest, how many of you have heard or read anything of Rainer Johnson? Ah, you see, much. That's an important point, actually. I'll come back to that at the end. Right, thank you. Well, I'd read a lot of his books, several of his books, and I found them pretty illuminating. And then I came across this one. I think I probably picked it up on a conference. Nurslings of Immortality, another wonderful title, Nurslings of Immortality. And I found it was rather different from his other books because it focused largely on the work of one man, and that one man, of course, was Douglas Fawcett. Now, I didn't find this an easy book to read, I admit, from the start, and I still don't find it an easy book to read, I warn you, if you try it. But it's a book I've gone back to several times, actually, because the ideas it explores do seem to throw light on a lot of very fundamental questions. And I'm not alone in that, because Leslie Weatherhead, another well-known name in the fellowship, he wrote the prologue or introduction to this book, and he said that the book, in his view, opens up new vistas of speculation, was epoch-making. And another quite well-known name, J.B. Phillips, he described the book as exciting, awe-inspiring, ringing a score of bells, flinging open windows. Okay, so what's so special about this book and the ideas it presents? Well, one remarkable thing about it was the reason why Rainer Johnson came to write it. And I only found this out sometime after I'd read the book in another of his books. That's a fascinating story in its own right, but I'm going to save that up to the end as a little treat because I want to keep you on tenterhooks for that. Now, let me be quite open and honest about this, as the politicians say. Quite clear about it, in fact. I'm not claiming that I can give you a comprehensive or adequate summary of Imaginism. It's much too complex, much too wide-ranging a theory for that, and I'm quite sure I haven't grasped all the complexities myself. All I can do is to pick out a few main points and some of their implications. But this is going to be my interpretation of Fawcett and Johnson, so I'm going to be distorting and simplifying their ideas to some extent, I'm sure. So you'll have to blame me rather than them. Okay, let's take a deep breath and get on with it. About time, you might be thinking. The key idea behind Fawcett's theory of Imaginism and Johnson's book about it is that imagination and imagining are really the basis of everything in this world and other worlds as well. Now, that's a very sweeping claim and a surprising claim, perhaps. Why should we think that imagination is so important? Why does it hold this elevated position? If we're thinking of human faculties, for example, surely something like reason is more fundamental than imagination. Well, Fawcett claims that imagining is the spring within the mind from which all other faculties, including reason, are derived. And to take an example, when we exercise our practical reason to plan or anticipate anything, we are using imagination. Take a simple decision like crossing a busy road. We use our imagination to remember our past experience of crossing roads, to visualize possible accidents, to anticipate our safe arrival on the other side. So our judgment, our reasoning, if you like, is all based on imagination. All of our small or big decisions and choices need imagination. What career to pursue, where to go on holiday, whether to get married or not, what dish to choose from a menu. Every choice, if you think about it, involves us imagining what the result of that choice might be. And there are much more obvious examples of how fundamental imagination is in the whole business of creativity in the arts and the sciences. Artists, musicians, writers, they create their work, obviously, partly at least, by exercising imagination. Science, often we think of as a supremely logical, rational activity. But many philosophers have pointed out that science, in fact, proceeds and develops by scientists forming hypotheses and theories to be tested out. And those hypotheses, again, are the products of creative imagination. So a very strong case can be made, I think, for imagination being central to human activity. But Imaginism, this theory of Fawcett's, that doesn't claim to apply only to human experience by any means. It goes much further than that. It sees God and God's creative activity as essentially imaginative. And that's a very important point. In fact, it identifies God as divine imagining with a capital D and a capital I. God is divine imagining. Nothing can exist outside divine imagining. That's what creates and sustains the universe. Well, that's an even more sweeping claim, perhaps, but if you think about it for a minute, if you believe that we are, in a sense, whatever sense it is, made in the image of God, whatever that does mean, it's not unreasonable, I suppose, to suppose that our dependence on imagination reflects, perhaps, in some way, God's fundamental role as an imaginer, as divine imagination. Now, any account of creation is bound to be very speculative. We're trying to grasp what is beyond our very limited understanding. And that's why, I suppose, all the great religious traditions, including Christianity, have their own creation myths and allegories. And they have to be approached symbolically, not literally. In fact, it's argued by some that all religious truths and insight can only be conveyed as myth and allegory, not as literal history. That's another debate. So Imaginism's account of creation also, I think, is best described in terms of pictures and analogies. So God's initial creation of the world, not just our world, but the galaxy and the universe, that whole creation, according to this view, resulted from an act of imagination, divine imagining. And that initial act, that can be compared to the creation of a great poem or a great drama or a great piece of music, something that's perfect in its beauty and its harmony, something that can't be improved, it can't change, it exists only for its creator. For example, in the case of a drama, the characters in the play are completely under the control of the playwright who created them. They don't have any self-awareness or any consciousness of their own existence in their own right. Well, that first stage of creation, Fawcett calls the initial situation. what happened at the beginning. And although it would have been perfectly beautiful, perfectly harmonious, because God had imagined it, nevertheless it had a limitation, a serious limitation. It existed only for the creator. It was static. It couldn't develop, just as the characters in the play can't develop for themselves. So God, if we can put it this way, then imagined that this static system that had been created, that could exist in a different form. The individual elements could be given degrees of awareness, degrees of consciousness. So the whole system would exist for them, not just for God, the creator, the author of the play. So to keep to that analogy of the characters in a play, instead of being completely under the central control of the author, they would no longer be docile puppets. They would become relatively independent, able to take charge of the plot, if you like. They could alter it, add to it, for better or sometimes for worse. So that new system, this development of creation, would have to allow for the introduction of chance, free will, pain and evil. That would be an unavoidable consequence. Okay, but how could this be done? How could that initial static situation created by God be developed into something more dynamic? Well, God's initial creation had to be sacrificed. It had to be changed, got rid of almost. Have to be sacrificed, but it couldn't, because it couldn't allow for any independent development or self-awareness. That self-awareness would have to be gradually encouraged to arise from the basic components. It had to be gradually raised at certain points from an unconscious to a more conscious level. Possible analogy there might be when we blow on the dying embers of a fire and fan a flame. We raise the intensity of the fire. But this would have to be a developing process. It couldn't happen all at once, and that's where evolution comes in. According to Imaginism, God uses evolution to set in progress and maintain an ongoing process which leads to the development of self-conscious individuals. So how might that all work? Well, this is where the theory gets even more interesting, in my view, because evolution is pictured as taking place from two directions, from below and from above, if we want to look at it in that way, from the physical, material level below and from the spiritual level from above. At the lower physical levels, the creation of basic elements takes place, and that produces individual components, electrons, atoms, molecules, and so on. But when they produce the right physical conditions, when they change in such a way that it's possible, they can take on board and be used by the higher imaginative creations from above. These higher creations, Fawcett calls imaginals. And there's all sorts of those, but that's much too complicated to go into today. So the imaginals descend, if you like, into the physical to help evolution progress and develop. Let's take an example. We need examples all the time here, otherwise we do sink without trace. Take the example of a flower. The picture here would be that when the basic chemical components of the flower produce a suitable order of molecules and what have you at the purely physical level, these higher creations of particular forms and colours and smells can use those conditions to appear, to become manifest. Now, why on earth should we accept that rather peculiar idea, you might think? Well, the argument goes, this is an interesting idea again, that those basic physical components can't account for qualities. They can't account for qualities like colour, sound, scent, even shape. Because there's no light or colour or scent in nature's basic components. There's only matter, basic components in motion, however you want to conceptualize that. Matter doesn't have those qualities. For example, there are no red, sweet-smelling molecules in roses. Now, I expect some scientists might well object to that idea. Some of you might object to it here. But to a non-scientist like myself, it does make a certain amount of sense that the more basic you go, the further you get away from the qualities that give things their characteristics. But these high-level creations from above, they don't only provide these qualities, they also provide solutions when necessary. Because the basic components have got their own sort of independent existence now, you get conflict, you get competition, particularly in the growth and development of biological organisms. And Fawcett and Johnson give some obvious examples here. For example, the evolution of amphibians, of birds, to allow creatures to conquer dry land or the air, so reducing the competition for food. Imaginism claims that these complex developments needed a number of novel variations to take place, either simultaneously all at once, or in very rapid succession. Otherwise it doesn't make sense. And that argument, which suggests some form of intelligent, imaginative planning at a higher level, that argument has quite a lot in common with what today is usually called, I think, intelligent design, an idea that many scientists are again opposed to, not all of them. But there's huge controversy over that, over intelligent design, as I'm sure that some of you know. And again, I'm not qualified to pronounce on that. But according to Imaginism, divine imagining, God promotes evolution by experimenting with these novel variations. And not although all of those experiments are successful. That's why some species die out, they become extinct, because a variation hasn't worked. And what's more, it's claimed that this experimenting goes way beyond life forms on this planet. The whole galaxy, the whole universe, according to Imaginism, is the result of these imaginative experiments which are going on all the time. God is essentially a creative, imaginative experimenter, if you want to put it like that. So you can begin to see from this, even this very brief outline, the huge implications of this theory. One of its main strengths, I think, is that it tries to reconcile two very different perspectives on creation and evolution. Perspectives that are often thought to be incompatible. The scientific perspective and the religious perspective. For example, the picture it paints of that initial state of harmony and balance being shattered, dispersed into countless independent units. That picture has certain echoes, I think, of the scientist's picture of the Big Bang. And it also reminds us, perhaps, because this shattering leads to eventually more consciousness and self-determination, it also reminds us of the religious myth of the fall from a state of perfection. In fact, Fawcett and Johnson describe the process as the metaphysical fall, and they show how it inevitably allowed for the possibility of chance events, conflict, pain, free will, must also allow for the possibility of evil. Also, that idea of evolution coming from two directions, below and above, that also reflects what's been described by some as the fundamental belief of all religious traditions, all the main religious traditions. the belief that the divine somehow enters, participates in everything in the physical world, including ourselves. Human beings are sometimes described as spiritual beings in a physical body. The divine and the physical, spirit and matter, intersect, and so incarnation of a kind takes place. And that's an image that occurs in different forms and different myths in pretty well all religious systems. One of my favourite modern theologians, for example, the Canadian Tom Harper, he argues that the underlying theme of the entire Bible, and indeed of most religions, is, and I quote him here, the advent into the evolving life of every human being of a degree of consciousness that is not generated automatically in the order of nature itself, but is the blossoming to maturity of the conscious potential in a seed of divine mind implanted in the order of nature from above. From above. That idea of a divine seed being implanted, that comes very close to the picture painted by Imaginism, and as I say, it's echoed in many religious traditions. Well, there's an awful lot more to be said about Imaginism than that. I could go much deeper, but I think that would be pushing my luck a bit. So, before we do all sink without trace, I'm going to change the focus just a bit. Some of you might well be thinking at this point, well, this is all very well, just about follow some of that. But what's this grand theory got to do with psychical matters, And I would have a lot of sympathy with that question, because we should never forget that the basic reason for this fellowship is as stated in the title, the study of psychical and spiritual matters. And that word psychical comes first, So what is there of psychical interest in all this, in Imaginism? Well, the theory itself does have possible significance for a number of psychical issues, in particular telepathy. Again, that would take much too long to go into in any depth, but Imaginism does provide a sort of underlying rationale for how and why telepathy can take place between human minds and between animal minds, shades of Rupert Sheldrake here perhaps, and even lower than that. But as I say, that's a whole nother subject for a whole nother talk. I want to finish by focusing on something rather more dramatic and surprising, because this book by Raynor Johnson that I've been referring to in itself represents a rather important piece of evidence for survival of death and of after-death communication. I can't get more psychical than that. As I said a bit earlier, this book is rather different from Johnson's other works. When I first read it, I wondered what had driven him to write it. Why should he put this tremendous amount of effort into this one man's theory? He says in his preface that his attention was drawn to Fawcett's work by a strange series of events. But he doesn't say any more about it than that. It's all a bit mysterious. And it was only some time later that I found the answer in another book of Raynor Johnson's, rather less well known, called The Light and the Gate. I haven't seen many copies of this. If you see one, get hold of it. The Light and the Gate, because the key to the mystery is here. In this book, Johnson writes about a number of people who'd influenced his thinking on religious, spiritual, psychic matters. And he devotes one section, quite a long section, to a friend of his who had died with the unusual name of Ambrose Pratt. Ambrose Pratt, remember Ambrose Pratt. The two men shared many interests in psychical, mystical questions, and one of Johnson's areas of interest was in the work of mediumship and the work of Geraldine Cummins. I'm sure Many of you will have come across Geraldine Cummins, possibly the best known, most productive writing medium, mainly writing medium. She did, I think, exercise other forms of mediumship, but she was mainly known for her writing mediumship. One of the best known and most investigated people in the history of psychical research. She was always very willing for her results to be scrutinised, investigated. She was a very hard-nosed lady. She was very critical of her own work. She didn't take anything for granted. And incidentally, she was an international hockey player for Ireland, so she must have been a pretty tough character, I should think, to do that. Well, Rayner Johnson had been very impressed by what he'd read about Geraldine Cummins, and he finally arranged a meeting with her in 1953, out of interest. And just a social call, he described it. He told her he'd never himself had any first-hand communication from anyone who died. He was fascinated by this subject. He'd never had any communication. And he left her a sample of his handwriting, just in case, possible psychic link when she was working on something else. A bit later, he received from her a script, which she had produced while holding this sample of his handwriting. And she was characteristically very modest about this. This is what I like about Geraldine Cummins. She said she was afraid it was probably all nonsense and a complete failure. And in that case, she said, just tear it up and forget about it. You know, rather different from some of the more high-powered mediums one comes across on other occasions. Well, this communication had come from a man who gave a number of details about his life and his connections with Rayner Johnson. Geraldine Cummins tried to get the name, and I'm not quite sure how this worked with the writing and the imagery, but never mind. She was shown the letters electron and told that these referred to the Greek word meaning amber. Electron, Greek for amber. And then she was shown a rose, from which she deduced that the name might be Amber Rose. She was then shown a little fish. Guess what sort of a fish it was, can you? Someone said it. A sprat. Yes, a sprat. And the communicator cut off the letter S from this little fish. So in this way, she said, he seemed to be making clear that his name was Amber Rose Pratt. Well, it was not far out. Now, if you're a Times crossword addict, as I confess to being, you'll admire the ingenuity that in getting across that very unusual name of Ambrose Pratt. And one thing mediums do agree about generally is that getting specific names is extremely difficult. That's also a nice example, I think, of images in another sense, the way in which images can perhaps be used for psychic purposes, often in many forms of mediumship. Well, Rayner Johnson confirmed all the factual information that he'd been given, and both he and Geraldine Cummins had no recollection, they said, and there's no reason to doubt them, had no recollection whatever of the name Ambrose Pratt having been mentioned at their brief social meeting. So Geraldine Cummins, 99% certain, had never heard of Ambrose Pratt. Johnson then asked her if she could make direct contact with him, and some time later he received another script, more lengthy script, apparently written directly by his friend. This was presumably Geraldine Cummins' normal method of working as a writing medium. And it claimed that Pratt was acting as a link, a go-between, between a group of scholars in the afterlife and Rayner Johnson. This group included the well-known Frederick Myers, the pioneer psychical researcher, and other early members of the SPR. According to the script, this group had recently directed Johnson's attention to Douglas Fawcett's work, and they now wanted Johnson to produce another book of his own based on Fawcett's ideas. This was important, it said, because the group believed that Fawcett had, quote, by a stroke of supreme genius, obtained the answer to the various riddles that haunt the minds of seekers after truth. Johnson was told he could add, very magnanimous this, he could add his own knowledge of psychical research and mysticism to Fawcett's philosophy, and this might help to reconcile religion and science and deal a blow to materialism. Well, understandably, Johnson was a bit taken back by all this, particularly as at that time he knew little or nothing about Fawcett's work. He had received a few weeks earlier a letter out of the blue signed D. Fawcett, didn't know who he was, and this praised Johnson's latest book and enclosed a publisher's leaflet advertising Douglas Fawcett's own books. So that confirmed, to some extent, what the script said about Johnson's attention having been directed recently to Fawcett's work. No one would have known about that, including Geraldine Cummins. Well, the communications between Johnson and Pratt continued, Cummins, via Geraldine Cummins. Lots of further details of Pratt's afterlife existence and the group he was working with. Not going to go into all that. Cut a long story short, Johnson agreed, somewhat reluctantly, because it was quite an undertaking he'd been given here. He agreed under some pressure to undertake this task of trying to write this book. And he says that while he was engaged in actually writing it, he did receive several communications from Pratt with suggestions and help, including some material apparently actually from Frederick Myers himself. When he finished the typescript, Johnson sent a copy to Geraldine Cummins, and soon after she replied with another script she'd produced again apparently from Ambrose Pratt. And he was obviously delighted with the final product. Quote again, "My usual prosaic calm has been shaken," he commented. "My dear fellow, you have surpassed yourself. I have been asked to convey to you from the group their congratulations and gratitude. But do not be elated. The book is very provocative and from some quarters will receive sharp criticism. It is a superb achievement and for that reason dangerous." Interesting. Well, all authors of course hope to get good reviews, but not many of them get them from the next world like that. So that's the fascinating background to how this book came to be written. As I say, it is in itself a form of evidence, which by no means everybody will accept, but is a quite convincing, I think, form of evidence for life after death. That's the fascinating background how it came to be written, and although I don't have any figures, I should imagine it sold many more copies and reached many more readers than Fawcett's original work. That's why I asked at the beginning how many people had heard of Fawcett, how many people had heard of Johnson. Far more people had heard of Johnson. So by this method, Fawcett's ideas reached a far greater audience, and they've reached a lot bigger audience this morning, I imagine. Now, skeptics, of course, they will try to explain all this in terms of telepathy, the workings of Geraldine Cummins' subconscious mind and all that. But in my view, at least, that sort of explanation is far more difficult to swallow than the more straightforward psychical one. So, is Imaginism true in some sense? Does it really provide answers to those riddles that haunt the minds of seekers after truth, as Ambrose Pratt poetically put it? Well, you'll have to make up your own minds about that, I think, but at least these ideas put forward by Fawcett and Johnson, which I've tried to present in a very truncated form today, they do make us think twice, I think, before dismissing anything as just imagination. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger, very much. An introduction into a hidden cupboard, a hidden corner in the history of the tradition that we're interested in, the relationship between unseen worlds, unseen dimensions, and what we call everyday reality. as some of you know, in a previous life, I was a bookseller. And one of the things that's interesting about, certainly looking back over bookselling, is how books that turn out to be significant were not significant on their publication, and in a sense have been discovered later. And books that are fashionable and informative and then become unfashionable. And the foundations, most authors say they're standing on the shoulders of other people, giants or otherwise. And I just noted down a couple of things that two significant thinkers, one well known to us of Rupert Sheldrake, his work, Teilhard de Chardin, the Catholic theologian. Now, Rupert in his current life, a great deal of criticism and scorn from the scientific community and largely ignored by church authorities because he's a worshipping Anglican Christian. And Teilhard de Chardin has been rehabilitated a bit. And of course this sort of tension goes back, I suppose, to Plato and Aristotle. You know, that famous, Raphael's famous fresco is Plato is pointing up there and Aristotle saying, look at that. And of course, I think our duty as human beings, as we're suspended between heaven and Charing Cross, as the poet said. Now, it's an interesting place to be, but it can be a bumpy ride. And I think for many people, don't like entering into what Henri Corbin, who Crawford Knox introduced to, the imaginal realm. And yet we do. We've only got to encounter, I've got now 3 youngish, small granddaughters. This is a great gift. And the delight of those of you who are grandparents or indeed can remember being parents is what our children give us when their imagination is not trammeled. And then the shades of the prison house close around the growing child. And I think we do that to ourselves. So I'm very grateful. I had actually vaguely heard of Douglas Fawcett, but as ever, I think one of the great gifts of our fellowship is introducing one another to ideas or to books with ideas in, or to other people living or departed, and so that we're part of a living organism. In traditional theological terms, we call it the communion of saints. Not only the saints departed, but the saints we are gathered here together. So thank you again, Roger, for that. I've got to add other things to my reading list. It's a good thing I'm retired, but to do that. Now, can I first of all say, with regard to questions, that please remember to write questions down and put them in the question box, so that the panel on Sunday has something to discuss. I mean, we usually do, and that's fine. All sorts of things. Are there any comments or questions immediately that people? Davina.
Well, thank you very much, Roger. First of all, can I thank you as chairman, because actually this whole conference was based on your theory of Imaginism, which you were starting off from. And during the sort of discussions, when it was morphing into different shapes, I kept saying, hold on, we mustn't lose Roger's idea of Imaginism. Though I must admit to my own self, I was thinking, I wonder what that's all about. I haven't read any of the books, but a week ago, I happened to, now I live on Purbeck Coast, which is Jurassic in content. We went off to an exhibition collection of fish and all these fossils. And I must admit, it's a very good visit. But it was the first time I was actually standing in amongst a whole load of fossils from the Kimmeridge Age, it's called. I suppose it was because I was surrounded with them that it really stopped me in my tracks. You tend to see dinosaurs and things like that, but these were all fish rather than dinosaurs. And it suddenly sort of really brought home to me how we go back such a long time. These were 250 million years ago, and to actually walk on the shore and find them underneath your feet, if you know how to dig them out, you can quite easily. And I don't think we go anywhere near trying to explore why this happened so many years ago. So your talk has sort of like illuminated that point, that it must have been some form of trial and error that we had dinosaurs and all the rest of it. And I know there's a great theory of that. But there's still the wonder of the fact that it happened like that. And I can't get my head round it. And I found it awesome. I really was filled with almost overwhelming awe when I was in contact with these very old fish and fossils and things. So thank you for your talk. It's very interesting.
Right. Thank you, Davina, for that. I think you're quite right. It is very humbling when you consider this huge span of time, sort of behind us, if you like, and we've just got to the top of the mountain. If you're not at the top of the mountain, we're at the end of it. We're sitting on top of this this progression, and how on earth did we get here? That's why I do like the idea from Imaginism of experiment, as you said, because if you think about it, all of this must be either blind chance, which is what some materialists will say. Well, it just happened. It's over millions of years. These things you'll get natural selection, etc. Or you write in some form of intelligent planning, in some form, not sort of creating a life form overnight, and that's why this idea of Imaginism. This theory does make some sense to me, the idea of experiment, working towards this very difficult goal of some form of independent existence, independent self-aware. How else could you produce, self-aware individuals other than through this incredibly complex, lengthy process that seems to have taken place? So, I share your awe.
As always, I am so grateful to Roger for opening up a subject that not only is fascinating as we listen to it, but carries with it the opportunities for recollection and tranquility, and adding our own ideas and thoughts as they arise later on. One of the areas which I don't think you did touch on, in which I feel imagination is paramount, is in something that we're all called upon to exhibit, which is empathy. Any form of approaching other people demands, in my view, imagining their situation and responding to their situation rather than to satisfy our need to express oneself. And that, of course, opens up the whole area of responsibility to use one's imagination to enhance the quality of empathy that we can show to others. I remember very well Bishop Butler, in Something Understood once, said, "Don't do unto others what you would like them to do unto you. They may not share your taste."
Absolutely.
And in fact, that is in a way at the heart of it. We have to imagine what actually is their requirement and their need, rather than ask them or try to give them what we actually would like to do. And this opens up a whole area of debate and interest, which I'm very grateful to have had sparked off. Thank you.
I don't know whether I will come to you. Well, I was going to say, did anyone see the other day on BBC 4 a program called Metamorphosis? Yes. Wonderful. Yes. Well, if you've got catch-up facilities, it's called Metamorphosis, and it looked at both metamorphosis and the sense of thing. How does the caterpillar know to turn himself or herself itself into a chrysalis and then to emerge with the same genetic makeup into a totally different organism, into a butterfly or moth? And it was, though it was introduced by a scientist, he was extremely open to the say, we just don't know. You know, we know, someone said, well, what triggers this? And they said, well, it's a hormone. They said, but what triggers the hormone? And it was very open, like many scientific programs now, they raised the question, we don't know, but we want to explore it. We want to use our imagination. And second, the other thing, which was because it's been on the last week on the BBC, a theme, some of you may have heard bits of things on it, to do with artificial intelligence. Someone was a mathematician was talking about the fact that they'd programmed a computer, an artificial intelligence computer, to start sort of questioning itself about things, and how things that could be regarded as selfish, as well as things that were empathic, started to emerge. Now, some people, oh, this is very frightening. Well, in a sense, everything we don't know can be frightening. So I think the interesting thing now in the field of human questioning, there's a whole lot of stuff, and it's interesting because of that the comparative ease of communication compared with Fawcett's time. If you're relying on publishing a book, there's a limitation. Things get onto the internet, they spread around and about. So I think we live in exciting times, despite us being fossils. Davina likes to be surrounded by fossils, but nevertheless is that...
I wondered about that too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think we may feel moving towards fossilization, but at the level of our imagination, we are not. One more...
Hang on, can I just have a brief reply to Jill? Thank you, Jill, for that, because you're absolutely right, and it was something I completely... actually, it's not emphasised enough, I think, in the books that I'm talking about. You're absolutely right. Empathy does require imagination, obviously based on imagination, and, I mean, many moral philosophers would argue, and psychologists say, empathy is the basis of all, well, and certainly of moral right action, you know, because if you haven't got empathy, you can't make a moral decision, really. I mean, psychopaths, sociopaths have that problem, very difficult to visualize, presumably, of lacking empathy in that sense. And, you know, we know what can result from that. So thank you for alerting us to that. Very important, empathy and imagination. I'll remember that.
One more, last question.
Roger, thank you very much indeed for your talk, which was absolutely riveting. I'm also reminded of Monica Grady, who's Professor of Interplanetary Sciences at the Open University. And she tactfully deplored the policy of encouraging science and maths, particularly, and academic success in that area, over the development of the imagination and the encouragement of the creative arts in all forms, which she said was fundamental to all the new technology and developments in her particular area and every other sphere.
Thank you very much, yes.
We need to call our meeting to an end now. Thank you very much for attention. You know, it's, as I said, it's introduced to one of the, you know, we're heirs to a golden succession of people with insights that is like stars, you know, powdering our history. The ones that speak to us particularly, we reflect, how did I come across this person? Whether it's an individual in their writings or just someone we actually met. William Temple, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who died in 1944, tragically young, said once, in answer to a question about prayer, I think he said, it's very mysterious. All I can say is when I pray, very often coincidences happen. And everyone here will have a similar sort of experience. So, Roger, thank you again. Give the gentleman a round of applause.